Raw and real data never lies, but it also doesn't just surrender its truth either. It just sits there waiting for somebody to be bold enough to interrogate it, decode it, and translate it into something useful and powerful. Hey, my friends, welcome back to the UNCOMMODiFiED Podcast. I'm Tim Windsor, and my guest on the show today for another UNCORK conversation, my favorite kind of conversation, is Rob Darling. Rob, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Tim.
Awesome. This is going to be great. Now, quick intro about Rob. So, Rob is obsessed with how we talk to data. But here's the kicker, and how data talks back. This is going to be an interesting conversation. Now, a bit about Rob. As a founder and CEO of RunQL, he's on a mission to help businesses adopt AI to speed up data insights without putting their business at risk, which is a delicate balance. Because speed is useless if you can't trust the data insights you're receiving. He's built and sold SaaS companies, led enterprise data initiatives, and knows that great questions lead to great insights, whether you're conversing with SQL, with a database, AI, or human to human. And when he's not building companies and doing all this data stuff, he'd rather be playing sports than just watching them, which says a lot about who he is. Now, this is an uncork conversation, Rob, and I did pre-warn you. So what are you going to uncork tonight?
I have the bottle here.
I love it.
Let me just grab it.
What's
It
the
is-
bottle? I always like when people grab the bottle.
I did an ode to Canadian producers.
Look at you.
So this is Sortilege.
Okay.
It is a Canadian whiskey and maple syrup from Montreal.
Nice.
And for me, it is one of my favorite whiskeys that has maple syrup in it. There's a lot of great ones like Tap 357, a lot of great brands out there. But this one, I think, hits the perfect mix between maple syrup and whiskey.
Oh, that's awesome. That's interesting because I've actually never had anything with maple in it, so I'll have to try that one. Now, I hate to say, in the midst of the time we're doing this, you're going Canadian, and I'm going with Brothers Bond, and it is an American bourbon. So I'm going to go American bourbon. I'm going to go brave tonight, and I'm going American bourbon.
Well, we got to drink one for our friendly neighbors south of the
We
border,
do.
and one for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other part of all that is, if you think about it, we've got to understand that I got to go to work to the US next week. So, I still got lots of friends in the US. So I'm not ready to totally give up on that thing yet.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this the other day. There's a lot of animosity right now, right?
Yeah.
But it's mainly based around one individual.
Correct.
It's not the whole country.
No.
So
No, it's not, and we have to probably just cooler heads need to prevail, I suppose, at the end of the day.
that's right.
That's
Yeah.
that's at least I think the way we ought to look at it. So listen, cheers to you, my friend. Thank you very much for joining me on the show.
Yes. Cheers.
That's a good drink. Okay, Rob, let's kick it off this way. So let's get into this with this big question. So I'm going to ask a really big question, and then we'll figure out how we're going to tease it out. So my big question is, how does language, how does query, how does translation unlock bold insights within the big data world you live in? And, this idea that you talked to me about. So I want to really understand. So how do we talk to data? Which, by the way, sounds like we could need some kind of help. But how do we talk to data? And how and can data talk back to us? That is a fascinating framework. So that's the big question. How does this all work? Get us into the world of Rob.
Yeah. Sure. I think the spot to start is human to human communication, right? So when you and I are talking, we're translating each other. We're trying to understand the questions that we're asking, what the person is really asking about, and then trying to translate that and then spit out an answer that we think is, where Tim is trying to go.
Yeah.
Databases are no different. You're using SQL to ask a question to get an answer from the data, and there's a translation there. I've got a problem, it's a human problem. I need to somehow understand the data behind that problem, and I need to use some sort of translation mechanism in between. For us as humans, that's our brain. Our brain is doing the translation, even in English to English, right?
Right.
And then in AI, as we've all seen with ChatGPT and other tools, there's a translation layer that happens there. You know that if you ask a question a certain way, you're going to get a better result than if you ask it another way. And so a lot of it comes down to how we comprehend a question and how the system can comprehend what kind of answer to give out.
Interesting. So I like this framework of thinking about data like a language. That is a very interesting way of thinking about it because I don't think it's the way I typically think of data. I don't think of it as a language. And I suppose if I'm using this sort of analogy, if I understood it more like a language, I would understand that translation obviously is important, but then how I speak to it or and how I interact with it becomes important because there is a nuance to that experience that's happening. And so how did you find yourself in this world? I mean, you've had a very successful career, and you found yourself in this world, and now you've got this new adventure you're moving into, RunQL, which is interesting. What's your journey here, and why is this so important for you and for all of us to consider?
Yeah, my journey started actually, if you really want to go back, my journey started with visually impaired students.
Wow.
Yeah, working for the Ministry of Education, and it's all related though. So if you're working with visually impaired students and you have to help them break down a problem because they don't have the visual cues to know how to do up a zipper, for
Hmm.
instance.
Yep.
So you got to break down those tasks and figure out a way to communicate those tasks in a way that they can understand, interpret it, and then do the action. Where with other human children who can see, you can just say, "Watch me do it,"
Right.
and they can do it, right? But when somebody can't see, you got to break it down and communicate it to them step by step to get them to do that action. Um, I went back to school for computer science. The human stuff was fantastic, but I got a little bored, so I went back to school for computer science. And long story short, ended up in a role as director of enterprise architecture for Manulife Canada, where they had this failing data project that had been going on for 2 years. They were trying to bring in business intelligence. It wasn't working. There was all sorts of issues. And so finally they tapped me on the shoulder and I got that implemented in 4 months. So a project that had been struggling for 2 years, I got in place in 4 months. And so that was my first kind of introduction to the data problems that organizations have. I'd done a lot of software engineering at that point, a lot of server systems and security and that kind of thing, but not a ton on the data side. And then from there, everything I did afterwards had to do with data. So every startup I did had huge amounts of data that we'd have to go through to figure out what was in the data, what were the behaviors that were happening, how are these users using the app, do we need to change things, what are the patterns that we're seeing here in this data, excuse me. So it just kind of evolved. It continued to evolve where most of my time in all my SaaS startups was spent in data,
Hmm.
understanding, in data for a reason, understanding people's behaviors in the apps, understanding patterns in the world, um, and that kind of grew into me building a data team at another company, and then eventually seeing this problem that we're solving today.
Hmm. And we're going to get into that problem because that's an interesting thing. I want to go back to, just this idea that, you and I chatted about, like this idea that great questions lead to great insights, whatever we're talking to, which is interesting to me because I have this sort of general bent. I actually believe that questions are a human superpower.
Yeah.
We don't think about them that way often, but in a very profound yet basic ways, the way I think of questions is questions have this innate power within them to do two things. So on one level, they propel or cause to happen a conversation or an interaction. Typically, when you ask a question, most people feel some obligation to respond. So there's a propulsion of conversation, a generation of conversation that happens when you ask a question. The other thing that I think a lot of people don't think about is that not only does it propel a conversation, it actually predicts it in the sense that, if I asked you a question, you love to play sports. So if I say to you, say, Rob, like, what's your favorite sport? If you could only play one, what's your favorite sport to play?
Yeah. Yeah. That's an easy one, right?
Yeah.
So I would say hockey.
Right. So
Yeah.
the reality is whether people understand or not, my question propelled, caused to happen, and actually predicted your answer, meaning the reason you and I aren't talking about the global political situation in Russia and Ukraine right now is because I asked you a question about what sport you would play. So in fact, my question, even in its rudimentary fashion, propelled, caused to happen, but it also predicted or bounded, created a box in which your answer typically would happen. So to me, this is the superpower, the simple superpower questions. I guess my question to you is, does the querying of a database have the same inherent superpower in it? The questions we ask, does it both propel and does it predict at some level the conversation that we're going to have with the data?
Yeah, 100%. I love the way you framed this. 100%, because if let's look at it another way. If you're ignorant of the other things that are going on, in your example, other parts of the world, right?
Right.
If you're ignorant of the other data that you have, then your questions are always going to be bound by the data and information that you have,
Right.
right? Um, but it's actually the question that propels other data to be brought in.
Interesting.
So if you and I are talking about sport and
Yeah.
we have no knowledge of Ukraine, we might start talking about sports in other countries.
Right.
And then we start talking about Ukraine, and then we're like, oh, I wonder what that data shows. And then all of a sudden we discover and explore more about Ukraine and what's going on there, right?
Yep.
Um, but I think that all on the surface, the question is the important part, but there's an underlying piece, and that is just curiosity,
Mm.
right? You have to be curious and you have to ask more questions. I was a judge last night for the University of Waterloo Data Science Club, and they had 350 students participate, which is amazing. They were highly engaged. And last night they were presenting their findings. And the amazing thing was that these teams were able to look at the data and make uh, deliver insights based on that data in a 2-week time period, and they had never seen that data before. And if I think about the insights that they gave, like they were giving good enough insights for people who have been in that space for a year or more, right? Because they were curious. The
Mm.
best ones were so curious, they didn't just come with insights, they came with more questions.
More questions.
They said, I looked at the data and I had this question. And so then I dug into the data, and then that made me have this question. And then I looked into that, and that made me have this question. And then I discovered this thing. And here's what I discovered. Um, and so it's the ability to be curious and to ask questions and cascade that open the doors to other areas that we might not have thought of originally.
That's interesting because we're so focused. When you think about it in our minds, when we say, if I say to somebody like Q and, we immediately say A, which is answer.
Yeah.
And what you seem to be suggesting is it isn't just question and then answer. It's question and then actually a curious second question. And that maybe is the power to drill down and rake that data, whether we're doing that in a human way in our own human brain, or whether we're doing that in complex systems that are doing that at multiple times faster than we can do it. Those subsidiary questions almost rake into the data in a different way.
Yeah, totally. If you think of, is it the three whys? Is that what it's? I think it's the three whys, right? So if I ask you, Tim, like, what's your favorite color, and you say
Blue.
blue, and I say, why is blue your favorite color?
Yeah, it's because I look good in blue.
Oh, and why do you think you look good in blue?
Because my wife tells me so, Rob.
Right? So I learned a lot more, like a lot more information there
You did.
than just the simple question and answer.
Correct.
So now I know that like Tim likes blue because he looks good, but he looks good in blue. His theory behind why he looks good in blue is actually because his wife says that he looks good in blue.
That's right. Because my general theory of life is if my wife is happy, I'm good. I'm relatively happy too, Rob.
Happy wife, happy life, as they say.
Yeah, as they say. So, I mean, you go on this big journey. You've had multiple companies, you've created them, and now you've got this new adventure. So, what is RunQL? So, explain a little bit about what this is, what your team does, and why another expression of what Rob wants to be? Because you've had lots of expressions along the way, and you probably could have settled into one of them. So why another expression in this idea of RunQL? And what is your team doing today, and what are you doing today that is exciting you the most? And what do you see as the benefit or the beneficial outcome for the people that you're partnering with?
Yeah. Hey, that's a lot of questions.
I know. I got a lot of questions, man.
Yeah. I like to say I have more questions than answers.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm on a podcast, I try to limit my questions because I end up interviewing the podcaster.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair
Right?
enough. You're not going to get very wise if you do that, Rob.
Yeah. So, well, let's start by the first thing. What drives me, what propels me to solve this problem, and solve these problems in general. So, I'm a big believer in, we'll call it servanthood.
Okay.
Okay. I'm a big believer in finding how I can provide service to others that propels them forward. And so, what is the best way, given my skills and abilities, to do that? So that's number one. I always look through that lens. Number two is I saw this problem and I went out and interviewed a bunch of data analysts, data leaders, business leaders, and I listened to their problems and saw this pattern in those problems that they described. And that kind of propels me because at that point I'm invested, right? Like when I hear enough people have a problem, I want to solve it for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's very human driven. I'm very human driven from that perspective. And so the way I like to think about it is I'm trying to maximize my service to others for the greatest value that I can provide to them. So that's number one. That's where we start. Number two is if I remember the order of the questions. This problem in particular, data analysts have been underserved in organizations, and data leaders. There's a change in expectations from data teams. So it used to be you can push them to a BI dashboard and say, "You go find the data. I've put it on a BI dashboard. You go find it." Well, with it just like Google changed people's expectations for apps. Chat and ChatGPT have changed people's expectation, and texting has changed people's expectations for getting data insights. And there's a lot of problems there. It's just a bottleneck, and it's slow and it's painful for everybody involved, both sides, the business and the data team. And so that that really intrigues me. How do we solve that? How do we help businesses move faster? How do we help them make better decisions? How do we help them get technology out of the way?
Hmm.
And I think, the greatest technology innovations is when there's less of an interface, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so people are used to kind of this chat interface. So how do we remove technology from it? Um, Remind me of your other questions, but I think I hit the first
Yeah. No,
two, maybe one and a
you
half.
did. I did ask a lot of questions there,
Yeah.
so I overloaded you with questions. So that's interesting. So you see this problem, you want to solve it. You put your team to work on it. So here's a question. I mean, so again, I don't know a lot about this world. I know a little bit about this world, and obviously my listeners come from lots of different worlds.
Yeah.
But this problem that we're talking about is that I've got data that I need to extrapolate some information from. And in the old way, maybe of thinking, I say, hey, I need a business intelligence tool. Give me a dashboard. I need to see the following data. Put it here. And now I got to get somebody who can write this complex way of extrapolating that data out. And now I can see it. Your world is starting. Your world and your idea is moving into a different direction here somehow. It's
Mhm.
moving away from a traditional way of how I would get that data out, or how I would get a programmer to get that data out for me. Your vision and the way that you're looking at now starts to approach this in a different way. How's that different way of approach now look for you?
Yeah, yeah. So let me start by saying for 30 years, we've been promised that these dashboards would democratize data access.
Yeah.
And then here we are 30 years later with the same struggles we had 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, and it becomes, if you're a small business owner, it's not as bad. But if you're, in a larger business, you now have hundreds of these dashboards.
Yeah.
And how do you find the dashboard that has your information? Like sometimes this one dashboard has the data, but it's missing one piece, and there's another dashboard that's almost exactly the same and it has another piece. And how do you find them? So that's one problem as they get bigger. The other problem is businesses just move faster now.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when you get a request for data, um, you need it today, but next week it's probably not valuable, um, or may not be valuable, right? So how do you enable data teams to answer those questions faster? And then there's going to be more questions, and then you're going to find out what's valuable, and then maybe you build a dashboard because it's consistent, right?
Right.
But there's all these ad hoc requests and exploratory work that happens in between there. So how we're handling it differently is when we started with a data analyst to allow them to just speed up the time that it takes them to write queries, to manage the queries. Think about it, for your audience, like documents. I've got a bunch of documents. How do I write those documents faster? How do I find my existing documents faster so that I can reuse them? Data analysts don't have that. They don't have those tools. They've never been developed for them. The second piece to that is how do we leverage AI in a way that doesn't put the business at risk? So I don't know if your listeners may not know this, but because there's a lot of hype around AI, and AI is really good at text summarization and creative, wording around things. But what it's not really good at is deterministic responses to structured data. So deterministic means if I ask a question, I always get the same response that happens in the same way, and I can be confident that the response I got is correct.
Mm-hmm.
AI LLMs are probabilistic, meaning that there's some randomness in there. Um, and so the average accuracy rate for generating queries to get data out of a database is 16.7%.
Oh my gosh.
So, if you're a business owner or a CEO, you're not saying, hey, everybody, throw your data into an LLM and ask it to give you answers. because you know that most of the time the answer is going to be wrong.
Yeah.
Now, you can use some special things that have called graph rag that kind of help ground the data in truth. Kind of like your example of we're talking about this context window, like hockey. We're talking about hockey, so then Ukraine doesn't come into the conversation.
Yeah.
You can ground an LLM with that truth and say, all the questions coming in here are about hockey. And that helps it increase the accuracy rate to 53% on average. But that's still like flipping a coin. So what we're doing is saying, hey, business user, you ask a question. If there's an existing query to the database that a data analyst on your team has already written, and it's been deemed as the source of truth for that particular question, we're going to respond with that. So now you, as that business user, see that, Rob Darling wrote this query. He's a data analyst on our team. He knows about this stuff. I can trust this data. But where we are using AI is to augment that data analyst. So if I ask a question as a business user and the answer didn't exist, the query didn't exist, it actually gets created for the data analyst. The data analyst gets a SQL query, which is a language used to talk to databases.
Yeah.
It gets they get an SQL query that they can then just review and modify. So they didn't have to write it from scratch. And when they click save, it's added to the dictionary of answers. So the next time a business user asks a question, it's already in the database and they can get the answer. That's one way. As it grows, we're taking it even further, where we're grounding these questions. For some organizations who are willing to take a little bit of a risk, we're allowing the AI to edit the query and respond to the business user without the data analyst. But we're allowing the business to make those choices. Okay. So the business can control that.
So they can. So again. So let me put this in my world, in my in my little head. So what you're describing to me, if my company partnered with you and your services, I have a bunch of data that I collect. Let's say in my world, I do leadership development, I do leadership assessments, I do organizational health assessments. Okay. Yeah. So let me put this into my world. So let me think it through so I can try to get my head around this. So I've got years of data in my system about leadership assessments of executives. I've got organizational health assessment data. I got all of this stuff. I might have year over year comparative data of different organizations or the same organization, but I got a bunch of data. Currently, right now, I hire a programmer, and my programmer, I tell that I want to see the data in this way. And so he's written a series of queries that query that information and bring it out to me in a static report. So I get a report of the data the way I want to see it. But there are times where I get the data out and it's very hard to compare that data. I get data about this year, the survey was done in this year, and then we did it 2 years later. And my crossing that data and understanding what's happening isn't always easy. So in this case, I have to then go back to my program and say, look, I really need a better way of getting this data to talk to one another. I got this. I actually want to do something I've never done. I want to do a broad-based study of all this data, and I want to understand what are the primary weaknesses of all the leaders I've ever done assessments on. Okay, so in the world I live in now, that's clunky. It's hard. I got to get my guy, and eventually my guy, he retires, can't find him. In the new world, the Rob world, and the RunQL world, I actually now, almost like I'm interacting with AI, I query, I ask the question of my system and say, hey, what does this look like? How does this data compare to this data? And there's no query that's written. So the system then says, hey, I'm going to translate what you said, Tim, into the technical language of database to SQL language, and I'm going to write for you the proper syntax of the query that's needed to be made to extrapolate what you want, and it's going to happen automatically. And depending on how I want to interface, I might have the choice to say, once you do that, please send it to somebody who actually knows what they're doing and let them verify that and say, yep, that's good, and go boom. But once that happens, that query that I made in an independent way is now available to anybody in my organization. But if I'm a little more risky, if I'm a little more risky cat, I might say I'll forego the data analyst vetting over here. I'm beginning to trust this thing. Let's just fly with that. And now it becomes a set query that can be used in multiple ways. But because I'm doing that, it's iterative for what I want. But then in somebody else, when my partners ask a different question tomorrow, it's now creating that and putting it in the repository. Am I tracking?
Yeah, you are, for sure. I think the important part there of the last statement is once we have all the queries
Yeah.
and we know that the queries are correct that you've been using,
Mm-hmm.
it's much easier to ground everything in those queries
Yeah.
in order to ensure the accuracy of future queries.
Yeah. Huh. That's fascinating because again, I run a very small business, really. Like it's not a big business, but we run into this problem right now. We have what I just described to you is actually a real problem It's an opportunity. We now have a bunch of data and we want to compare it in different ways, but it's clunky. It's really hard, and frankly, it's very expensive,
Right.
and it's difficult. And to be honest, even at that, I don't always trust it. So I
Mm.
find myself going back and doing a lot of, frankly, like caveman verification, where I'm literally I'm exporting the CSV file out of the data, and I'm running I'm sorting that CSV file, and I'm actually comparing it across to this extrapolated data, and I'm checking it in 8 or 10 places because I got to validate, do I actually think this whole thing is correct?
And you just described what a data analyst does.
And
That
I
you're
am no
you're
data analyst, Rob.
you are no, actually you are a hidden data analyst.
Oh my gosh.
But that is exactly what a good data analyst does, right? They look at the data and they say, okay, this looks pretty good, but I need to just double check some things,
Yeah.
right? And they go and look at the raw data and they say, does this align with what I've output in this report? Am I missing something? Is there some nuance? Because often there is a nuance
Yeah.
that you're missing, right?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing. And again, if you're listening in, I mean, this conversation is for a subset of my listeners. I've got listeners in a bunch of different countries, and they listen for lots of different reasons.
Mm.
And for those of you who listen to the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast, it's a bit of all that and a little bit of a kettle of something. We don't know what's going to happen next. So this conversation isn't maybe for everybody. But at the same time, I would say that there's a general application to anybody listening. Forget if you're into big data or business or not. There's a part about this, which is, again, the questions you ask of the data that you are analyzing either in your mind or in society or even a conversation with a friend. The questions you ask are critically important, and the assumptions and biases you bring to those questions are critically important to create that conversation either with another human or a system. So the big macro thing is questions are critical because they drive everything. So regardless of whether you're applying this to your big data business or to your big data life and the conversation you had with a friend, those principles are really true across the board. But for those of you who listen and are looking at this from a larger data set perspective in your business, I would challenge you to ask yourself, like, what does the approach that Rob's talking about, what would it do for your business? Because there is a fundamental difference in the way that you're approaching this, Rob. There's something fundamentally different and quite fascinating and a little bit magical about it, in the sense that you're gonna create a whole different world and accessibility to people that is not available today in the traditional ways that we look at these things.
Yeah, 100%. I think I'm sure a lot of your listeners are, have needed data for their job,
Mm-hmm.
have, wherever they work, and have had the pain of having to wait for the data team to respond
Yeah.
with data. And so if they can ask it in a natural language way, and still know that they get a trusted insight that's based on foundation or based on a data analyst response, then they can be confident in their decision that they need to make.
Yeah.
But that is the real balance. There's a balance between speed and trust. There were lots of solutions out there that took natural language and translated it to SQL for you, just for the business user. Nobody else was in the loop ever, wasn't really grounded in anything. And those have all failed because they missed the most important factor, and that is trust in the insights,
Yeah.
trust in how you got to the insights. And LLMs are a black box, so you really need to ground them in truth.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I think about even yesterday, I had a meeting with a client of mine and working with sort of some newly formed an executive group and a director group and having a conversation with them and leading them into sort of, what does it look like to come together in a new season? And they're on the back end of a large enterprise, ERP changeover and of course now, they're coming from a very antiquated system historically, very solid system, but very antiquated and very difficult to get programmers who could support that anymore. And then, they made this decision, which was a massive decision, to move in a different way. And now they have a whole different, ERP system and enterprise software, and it's running their whole business. And of course, now they've got a series of dashboards, and they have a team that's creating these dashboards. And even yesterday in the conversation, there was this question about, I really would, one of the business leaders saying, I'd really like to know this. And then, of course, we're going to have to get in the docket to get that put in the dashboard.
Right.
Like, oh, well, man, is it not in the, it's not in the current dashboard. Oh, no. And so I'm thinking about this conversation yesterday. And what I'm hearing you say, if this company was employing the discipline and product and the team that you are working in, what happens at this point is that person says, you know what? I'm going to ask the query. I'm going to query the system, and I'm going to ask what I want. And it's going to create a query. It's going to verify it or get it verified. And then I'm actually going to be part of the creation of something, and then it's going to feed back something. And because there's systems and checks and balances, I'm going to be able to say, you know what, that data is relatively or rather or really trustworthy. And then that query is available to anyone else. And we can pack on and sort of build this thing. But now I don't have to stack up behind the last 40 requests.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the brilliant piece of this, because even yesterday this came up in a conversation and you could see everybody, oh yeah, that'd be great to understand that. And then you feel like the deflation in the room. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
we're going to have to get that another dashboard.
Because it takes a lot of teams at least a week, maybe 4 weeks, and sometimes even longer to
Yeah.
create one of those dashboards.
Yeah.
Right? It's a long process, and the sad part is organizations end up with hundreds of them, and people forget about them. And then this leader that you're, this example, a month or two later, they'll come back and they'll ask the data team, like, where's that dashboard? Or I need this data, but I need it with this filter, and that dashboard doesn't support that.
Yeah.
So it's just like it
I
never
forgot.
ends.
I forgot. I need this too. I
Yes.
need it I need it factored by this. Oh no. Jeez.
And if we just accept the fact that people are going to have more questions based on every response,
Mhm.
and we actually build the systems to accommodate that, then they can get the answer they need, right?
Yeah. Well, and I go back to something you said earlier, Rob, which is very interesting. I think it's connecting for me right now. You talked about the brilliancy of these students that you just went to judge, and you talked about some of the most fascinating journeys was they asked a question, they got some insight, but it drove them to ask another question and another question, another question. The challenge in the older way of looking at this is you ask the question, the data team has to build this thing. Actually, that second question is almost a punishment to the data team because now they got to go back and do it again. So maybe you don't ask the second question because you go, man, I really want to ask it another question, but man, I feel like I just probably burnt all my money with these people already. But what you're saying to me is that the architecture and system that you guys are building and the way you're moving, it's actually more of the mind of that student where I get to ask the data a question. Then intuitively it builds this query. And then I actually, when it comes back to me, it should ask me to ask another question. And I can ask it another question. And I can drill down again and create another layer. But I get to do that through my own interaction and curiosity. And curiosity to want something different doesn't become this conundrum for the data team where they keep saying, that Tim Windsor, can he stop asking questions and trying to get me to screw around with the dashboard? This new system is saying, Tim, ask me another question. Ask me again, and we can rebuild it. That's where I feel like I can hear this going, which I think is just wonderfully brilliant, because at the end of the day, that means I get to be as smart and curious as those students.
100%. I think exactly to your point. Imagine you've built up a collection, a catalog of all these queries.
Yeah.
And so now in an organization, everybody who asked this question, the next questions they had were this. And you can actually show that to the user now. It's much like Amazon shopping, right? Like if you look at a product on Amazon, they say customers who bought this product looked at these 5 products. Well, we can do the same thing now because we've captured all those queries. Tim asks a question. We can now say, hey, Tim, people who asked this question before in your organization, ask these 5 questions next. You don't have to go down that path, but you can at least leverage that path to feed your curiosity.
Wow, Rob, it's a brilliant conversation, and I really, really appreciate it. And so here's a question: let's say somebody's listening to this conversation, and they've got a lot of big data, and they want to ask a bunch more questions of it, and they want to free themselves somehow from the old way of having to be the architects of all these things in the background, and they want to find this new way of brailing and touching that information. How do they hunt you and your team down?
Yeah, great question. So they can find us at runql.com. If any of them actually go to runql.com/meet, let me just double check that.
Like you're verifying the data. I like this.
Yeah. Actually, if they go to runql.com/meet.html,
Okay.
it will automatically open up my calendar and they can book a meeting with me to talk about anything they want related to data.
Awesome. You know what? Listen, if you want to ask better questions of your big data, if you want better intuitive answers that become iterative in nature, that allow you to control the exploration and become even more curious without feeling like you're burdening everybody around you, you know what? That's a great URL that you ought to visit. So, Rob, listen, really appreciate it. So let me take this conversation in a totally different direction for a second. My podcast is this idea of uncommodification. And, one of the reasons when you and I chatted why I was so interested in having you on the show is, you are clearly a very uncommodified individual, the way you want to look at the world, the way you want to look at data, the way you want to serve the business problems that people have, and understanding the information they have and gleaning those insights. So I'm interested to know, when you walk in a room and you're bringing in that room the thing that only Rob can bring, that unique expression of Rob that has some kind of unique and positive benefit maybe to others around you. What's Rob doing?
Yeah. So when I walk into that room, the thing that I bring is I understand change. I understand how to change systems. I understand. I grew up around change. Long story short, that's the short of it. And so I learned how to adapt. I learned how to help others adapt. And so when I come into that room, I really understand what the motivations of people are,
Hmm.
what their desires for change are, and how I might be in service of those desires to change. And it turns out that for a lot of organizations, it usually comes down to data because data is what drives the decisions in order to make the change.
Yeah. Awesome. I love that. I think it's a really, I mean, I think it's a wonderful, unique expression of who you are. You and I have you chatted only one time before chatting now, and I have to admit, Rob, I just super inspired by this conversation and the one we had before. It makes me want to. It makes me want to understand what data do I have available to me, whether it's enterprise data in my business or whether, frankly, it's just the human data I get every day in the exchange that I have with people. And I want to ask better questions of it. I want to ask better questions that are not necessarily already having drawn a question that's already drawn a conclusion, and I'm trying to ask a question to get people to tell me what I want to hear or what tell me
Mm.
what the data I want the data to tell me, but to actually ask questions of data and of others in such a curious way that I actually can become alarmed or surprised by the answer and the learning that comes from it. That to me would be is part of the journey of being human. And we're talking about AI and we're talking about data, but actually going back to the where we started, it's all about that human exchange between information and the processing of that for a better outcome, a bigger understanding of the worlds we live in, whether that's a business world, whether that's a community world, whether that's the global world we live in. So again, if Rob and his team could help you in a way, please connect with them. I'm interested to know if, as you listened in, if you found something of interest in this conversation, either for yourself or your business. Do me a favor, email me at tim@uncommodified.com, and let me know how you're processing this, how you're uncorking this idea in your life, and how you're asking better questions of data and how you're letting data speak to you. Rob, thanks so much for joining me. Cheers. Thank you.